There are two first days. The first is that I came to interview at ISI. And so I do remember meeting Jon Postel, who even at that point in time was someone who was very well known, who was building this thing called the Internet. And I was prepared for the fact that he is this hippie-like character with a long gray beard and his Birkenstock sandals. So I definitely remembered meeting Jon Postel and being impressed by his humility for someone so accomplished. And the second time I remember because I started at ISI on February 29th, 1988, so it was a leap year. And I remember being struck by just the beauty of where it was located and how could anybody get any work done when the views out to the ocean were distracting us and the seminar room was, had two sides of windows looking out at the coastline and the mountains in the distance. And my office actually faced in the other direction, so for certain parts of the year I could see snow on the mountains in the distance. And it was just a gem of a place that had an atmosphere of collaboration and welcome. I was being interviewed by Jon Postel for a position in the Multimedia Conferencing Project. And this was a project that was trying to bring audio and video to the internet, which at the time was being used for file transfer and email and things like that. But there was no real-time media. I mean, it's hard even to imagine at this point, given that the vast majority of traffic on the internet now is multimedia. So I was being interviewed to join the networking division, which was led by Jon Postel and Danny Cohen, both luminaries. And I had gone back to graduate school at UCLA to get a master's, and I joined Len Kleinrock's team, also a luminary, kind of another father of the internet. And so his team was looking at models for how you did packet-driven technology. My background was in distributed systems, and we were looking at distributed algorithms. And what was remarkable about that moment in time was that we think of networks and the internet as being everywhere, but it really wasn't as pervasive then. When I graduated college in 1983, there were a few hundred nodes on the network. When I interviewed at ISI in 1988, there were maybe about 30,000 hosts on the network. And by the time I left 6 years later to go back to graduate school again, I think there were on the order of a few million hosts on the network. And that was around 1994, maybe about 4 million. And so in that short space of time, there was all this connectivity. So I was being interviewed ostensibly to join this burgeoning networking team at a moment in time where the internet itself was becoming something. And it was still not commercialized. And so a lot of what was going on at ISI was research, and a lot of the questions we pondered were, how is this thing going to work, and how is the audio and video that we want to bring to the internet going to work in a packet environment? And so Danny Cohen was someone who in the 60s started working on how do you send audio and video over these packet networks. I then was going to report to someone by the name of Steve Casner, who was running this multimedia conferencing project. He joined in the 70s. And then I considered myself sort of this third generation ISIer who was going to focus on conferencing. How do we bring multimedia conferencing to the network? So the first application was to enable people to make phone calls over the internet. And if you extrapolate from there, you want to have multi-party, multimedia sessions among people. And ultimately you want to share what's going on your computer. And so this was the beginnings of that. And the funny part about contrasting now with then was that we weren't even doing personal multimedia conferencing. People didn't have all of this built into their computers. There were no cell phones at the time. In fact, we were doing room-to-room teleconferencing. And so it was an application being used by the researchers themselves between the research institutes that were building out what became known as the internet. There clearly were some amazing women who eventually became mentors to me, but unlike now, there were many fewer. And one of the great things about the networking community was that the women's network was alive and well. So there were people at ISI, for example, like Deborah Estrin, who after about my second week on the job, walked up to me after the networking seminar, and she said, "Hi, I'm Deborah Estrin, and we need to meet because we're the only two women in the room." And so, there were instances like that, but then there were people within the IETF, like Leisha Zhang, who's a professor at UCLA now, but was at Xerox PARC at the time. Or there were people like Karen Solins from MIT, or Kathy Nichols, Allison Menken, who eventually came on board at ISI in Washington, D.C., who were all people who, if they didn't exist, I don't think I would have stayed in the community. They made it feel like they were examples of women who had succeeded in this environment that was largely male. One of the things that I think about a lot is the training ground. ISI was a great training ground as a researcher, but the IETF was a great training ground for life. And being a woman in technology, in that, again, imagine hundreds of people assembling for these 3 times a year meetings where we're trying to develop standards for the internet. And it was a pretty hostile territory at that time. Not deliberately so. It wasn't personal. It was just that there was a lot of very excited people about designing standards who had a modality of expression that if you weren't used to it, it could be pretty alarming. I remember going to my first IETF. The IETFs, at this point, I think we're up at 114 IETFs have met in its lifetime. And at that point in time, maybe they were a couple hundred people assembling. But in any case, you'd go to these meetings and you'd get up to make a point, and it was not the easiest environment to navigate. I was a little bit put off by just the pointedness of the comments. And I think as long as you could stay on topic, making it, these were technical discussions, and these were not about, people were not being personal about it. They were having technical debate, but it was definitely like people really enjoyed debating the minutia. And I always have felt that that was a great training ground for being at a high-tech company and learning to navigate, having really opinionated, loud people who always want to talk over you. And so the ITF sort of helped me build a thick skin, grow a thick skin. And so I'm appreciative for that now. The culture, of course, is a lot more welcoming now, but I'm grateful that it helped me to see, one, that there were other women out there, even if they were few and far between, who became pillars or mentors. But two, that you have to technically stand on your own 2 feet and not be put off or felt intimidated, not be intimidated by those around you. Steve Casner is someone who is well known for his work in standardizing the fundamental protocol called the Real-Time Transport Protocol, which again has its lineage from Danny Cohen's work in the 70s. But what Steve did, and what he mentored me to do, was to take some of our work here and bring it into something known as the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the place where internet protocols were being standardized and specifications published and so forth. A lot of the work and a lot of the focus was on audio and video, and I realized there was a gap in the sense that there are signaling or control protocols that live above the transport protocols that help to initiate and manage the sessions among multiple people across the audio, video, and shared workspaces. And that was really my focus, was to work on the signaling or control protocols. And the one that grew out of our work is something called the Session Initiation Protocol, which has been used by billions of people in the same way that the real-time transport protocol has been used everywhere. So my focus was this complementary work on signaling. If you think about how much a single stream of video takes up in terms of the bandwidth on the network, first off, the network, as I already explained, was a fairly small network. And in terms of the bandwidth that it supported, it had issues sending kilobits per second over the network. And even originally in 1988, the quality of the images that we were looking at were something like 120 by 100 pixels. That's fairly ineffective for creating real video conferencing as if you were in person. But it was a good tool to demonstrate that we could deploy audio and video packet processing over the network. One of the things that was also interesting was this, the audio and video take up quite a different amount of bandwidth over the network. And so they would often take different routes over the network. So they'd traverse this network via different paths, which meant that when they got to their destination and some listener, you had to synchronize them. And so a lot of the experiments were about just what you'd consider lip sync, and we still have problems with this. But we were building out protocols, or our partners were building out protocols to do synchronization across the network. What we were trying to demonstrate, I think, as the first demonstration of distributed music over the internet. So we thought, why don't we have multiple sites of performers across the network? One of the sites being our funding sponsors, as well as our partners at BBN in Boston, and then ISI in Los Angeles. And so we were trying to demonstrate, could you do live performance? And of course, you just can't get around some of the broader delays that you're going to encounter. And so it was a somewhat contrived performance. Everybody got to hear the music being played and reassembled at the destinations, but they weren't necessarily playing with each other. Just the delays were too long. So that was some of the work that we pioneered, was, could you do distributed music? When you have interactive audio, your ear can tolerate, and the conversation can tolerate on the order of hundreds of milliseconds for the conversation to still seem natural. But if you go above a few hundred milliseconds, this is when people start to interrupt each other in these video conferences where there's a lot of delay or packet loss because they don't know whether you finished your sentence or not, or whether you're continuing. But with live performance, the interactions are much smaller. So we really were trying to stay below a few tens of milliseconds. And if you think about performers on a stage, they're just, or in a football field, in a stadium, you're talking about single digits. We picked a piece by Haydn that was a piano trio. And we selected it because if you think about having 3 people across the network, each having different delays, each of their packets having different delays across the network, how does a conductor raise their baton to signal to them to start now? So we picked a piece of music that had somewhat of a continuo. It began first, the piano part begins first, and then everybody hears it and synchronizes to it. And so that was how we started. All of the multimedia applications that we take for granted, that they just work, many of them are running over the real-time transport protocol, all the streaming services. For example, FaceTime on your iPhone is using the session initiation protocol. Netflix is running the real-time transport protocol. So there's some big infrastructures and commercial entities that have employed these standards. One of the beauties of ISI was that it was part of this community, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and just the broader set of researchers who were working on the early ARPANET, NSFNet. These were sort of pockets of activity building out the internet. And they were doing this being funded by the US government. And as a consequence, all of that work and the network itself was public. Somewhere in the 90s, that funding was curtailed. And although the NSF and ARPA, continued to fund researchers, most of what became the internet was through commercial entities. And that turning point really changed the flavor of interactions. And so up until that point, there wasn't really a lot of discussion about intellectual property or ownership of the standards. And so, of course, many of the early researchers at ISI ended up being called into disputes, litigation, where people claim to have tried to patent things that had been formally worked on much earlier by ISI, which was, somewhat of an unfortunate outcome. So the nature of the work that was going on early on was extremely open, but later on became complicated by the fact that there were corporations that were patenting their algorithms that then the standards were going to use. So I would say that there was a big shift maybe in the middle of the 90s, the end of the 90s, to try to ensure that researchers were forthcoming, especially if they were at commercial companies, about the intellectual property when these standards were being designed. So imagine if ISI had decided there was going to be a licensing fee every time that you wanted to use some of these algorithms that became standards, which is what other companies ended up doing, say, in the wireless domain like Qualcomm. That changes the whole nature of the standards process and how open or not open it's perceived to be by others if you have to pay a licensing fee every time you use something. The network and the idea of getting a network of things to work together, it's inherently collaborative. And so it means that those involved in that endeavor have to come up with a way to coordinate, not just to connect things together, but to really collaborate and understand what's happening collectively. And I think that just fostered a community of people who just wanted to get stuff to work. And I think they could recognize and see how exciting it was that this network was growing. I do think that this goes back to the idea that the government was funding this, and it was largely researchers working on this. Part of the motivation is just the tremendous potential for connecting things, and the sheer number of applications that you can enable. I always lament that I work in networking because I have lots of colleagues who work in graphics or in film. And it's very easy to convey the importance of something like that because it's beautiful. Whereas networking is plumbing. But you can't do any of this other stuff unless you have the plumbing. And so I think that some of the motivation was just people could imagine what you could do with it, even though we weren't able to do all of those things just yet. Being a researcher is a creative process because you're trying to push the envelope on what's possible. And all of these folks were imagining what was going to be possible. And even though they didn't have the bandwidth and they didn't have a really large network yet and they didn't have all the use cases laid out in front of them, they were constantly pushing the envelope. So when I first arrived at ISI, some of these experiments in audio and video were happening over a satellite network. And we've already talked about how satellite networks have big delays, on the orders of potentially hundreds of milliseconds, or at least at that time. And so how that might impair what you were trying to do in the first place, which was send audio and video for interactivity. Eventually that became a terrestrial network, an experimental terrestrial network. And then the follow-on to that was something called the DetNet, which was a playground for researchers at a half a dozen or so research institutes, including MIT and Xerox PARC and BBN and ISI, and SRI in the Bay Area, to interact and take this thing apart and imagine what would it look like if this thing were to scale up to what it is now. I landed at Intel in 2005, and I guess one of the themes that I have had throughout my career is this idea of collaborative computing, distributed computing, networks, multimedia. And what I do at Intel now, I'm part of the Internet of Things group, and I straddle with the Next Generation and Standards team. And so I'm still working on standards, so that's a theme that has pervaded all my work. When I look back, clearly the Internet of Things is something that was impacted by ISI's work on enabling connectivity. And so now when we talk about the numbers of things that are connected, there's something like 50 billion devices connected on the internet now. And that's what the Internet of Things is. It's just the internet, but it's kind of reached out and touched everything, that whether it's appliances or phones or cars, everything's connected at this point. So there's certainly that theme. But I would say that some of my work has always been with regards to real time. So one of the facets of my work right now is to look at deterministic networks, ones that ultimately are hoping to provide a guarantee of service with regards to ensuring that there's still low latency, and that there's low packet loss, and that there's low jitter, which is the variance of the delays. And all of that goes back to this work on interactive voice and video. I'm no longer applying it to interactive voice and video because we know how to do that. But now in the Internet of Things group, I'm looking at industrial IoT. So what do control systems look like in factories? Well, it turns out that the kinds of delays that they require are even lower by several orders of magnitude than what we need as humans to interact. Machines need less than a millisecond, some applications for control systems. So I'm still involved in trying to bring deterministic networks to life in these industrial IoT use cases. So that's one kind of way in which my work at Intel relates back to my work at ISI. Yes, we want to connect people, and we want to ensure that there's utility in providing connectivity, but I think there's also a broader hope that what we do with computing is for social good. And so we're hoping that the networks that we create will enable data that then we can apply analytics to, that will make situations better, whether that's in factories for anomaly detection or for predictive maintenance, or even bigger societal issues like sustainable manufacturing or sustainability in general. And so all of that needs a networking fabric to convey the data and to help steward the data in ways that are meaningful for not just having people speak, but solving our societal problems. The interesting thing about the Internet of Things is that everything becomes a sensor. Everything can generate data. And everything can generate high-frequency data. And once that begins to happen, you risk the danger that you're leaking information about people's personal identifying information or privacy. For example, one of the applications one of the projects that I got involved in at Intel was, for a time I was working in an energy and sustainability lab. So we're looking at smart homes, and that's smart grids, smart homes, smart neighborhoods, smart cities. All of those require connectivity, but all of those also require a lot of data. And to understand, well, how are we making those contexts intelligent? And how are we optimizing them or making them efficient for human habitation or saving energy, turning off lights in homes automatically, and things like that. So we were looking at smart homes, and one of the issues that arises when you're collecting whole house energy data is that once you begin to collect it with high frequency, you can begin to see things in that data that maybe have nothing to do with the whole house energy usage. Meaning, yes, there's this number about how much energy you're using, but now I can see, based on that number, just that single number, how many people are in the house? Are they awake or asleep? Are they working on their computer displays? Are they watching a TV? Are they using a microwave versus an oven? And all of that is something that leaks from that domain of data unintentionally. And so we have to protect the data. We have to protect the people in those houses from releasing this kind of information. So the question now is, now that everything's connected, now that everything can behave as a sensor, how do we ensure that there's data privacy? And so we have to make sure that we're careful about who sees the data, who owns the data, who releases the data, who's given permissions for the data to be released. And in other parts of the world, like in Europe, their regulations about privacy are much more stringent than in the US, which we hope will catch up at some point. And certainly in California it is. When I was growing up, there were all these questions about the scientists who had dropped the atomic bomb. Well, how did they didn't drop the atomic bomb, but dropping the atomic bomb led us to ask, did the people who created the original technology imagine that it was going to be used as such, right? If you're building a bomb, there's a closer tie. You're building technology, in the case of the internet, it was not the intent for it to be used to be harmful, for malware to permeate, or for phishing activities to happen on the network. But it begs the question, should we be educating our technologists and scientists and researchers in order that they're sensitive to the fact that whatever it is that they build and develop is going to have two heads. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. I don't think we can control these outcomes, but I do think we need to think about some of these ethical issues early in the life cycle as we build the technology.